Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Archival Discourses. This week, we're going to be carrying on what I was discussing, or reading rather, last week, which was looking at the political essays of Oswald Spengler. So we're going through a collection of essays that were published by Imperium Press last year, called Pessimism: The Political Essays of Spengler. So there's quite a few different ones in this set. I read two of the longer ones last time. What I hope to get through today is going to be another of the longer ones, and then I think a shorter one as well. So here we go. New Forms of World Politics. Lecture held on the 28th of April 1924 at the Übersee Club in Hamburg. If anybody today tries to speak to Germans about questions of world politics, you must be prepared for the objection that the time for us to engage in great politics is definitely over. After Bismarck had barely brought it about, we no longer have an army or a navy, we're diplomatically under the control of hostile powers, and we are economically shaken to a degree that is not yet remotely understood by the great mass of the German people, but even by the economic leaders. It is so important to even think about these things. We are a state which, since the revolution of 1918, has ceased to count in the combinations of world politics, except as an object for the will and interest of other powers. Every small and medium-sized state is allowed to make its own decisions, but not us, and there are many people in Germany, entire parties, who praise this as salvation, as progress, and the people who consider themselves politicians because they eat up ministers' salaries and MP salaries, or ultimately just because they are voters, consider the discussion of internal political trivia to be more important. But nevertheless, there's nothing more important for us precisely for this reason. Again, very interesting opening by Spengler. Again, because of the year, this is him largely reacting to the state of Germany after World War One, after the Treaty of Versailles, where she was disarmed, could only have an army of 100,000 men, was not allowed a navy, and so Spengler sort of lamenting the diminished international standing of Germany. And it's very interesting calling back to Bismarck there, because Germany was only quote unquote unified in 1871. And so there's this idea that Germany was not part of international affairs prior to 1871. And so from 1871 to 1918, you had this like half century of German involvement in world affairs. And this is a real setback for Germany as a nation. We see how all around us in the whole world, which for the first time is becoming politically active as a whole, not playing a passive role as a background to European entanglements, things are drifting in a completely new order, and with growing unrest towards unknown goals and in surprising new forms of unknown discharges. The World War was far from bringing a solution to the great problems of the last century. On the contrary, it ushered in an era of immense decisions, the magnitude and dreadfulness of which no one dares to visualize today, even if they could foresee the future. If we consider this situation and events of recent years, we can see how dark, unforeseeable possibilities are emerging everywhere, which could one day become of decisive importance for us Germans. And even if we want to and must forbid ourselves from publicly expressing certain hopes, there is still a need, far more than in the past, to look beyond the wretched filth and bickering that goes on inside Germany, under the name of politics, to the surface of the globe as a whole, to see what is being prepared there and in which direction things are developing, that could one day become hopes for us and even more. The first phenomenon that dominates the politics of Western Europe these days is the supremacy of France. This is a fact that was still beyond all probability in 1917. During the war, France was the state that was most dependent on the goodwill of its allies, and would have been utterly lost had it been for the bayonets and the inexhaustible billions of the Anglo-Saxon world that saved it time and time again from the ultimate danger. Even before the war, the French people, owing to the lack of berths, had long been the last but one of the great powers in terms of numbers, and in a very short time, as is the case today, they are bound to occupy by far the last place. Aging, tired, inspired only by the desire to consume its pension in safety and to indulge in a little love and literature, it was destined, like Spain at the end of the 18th century, to disappear from the ranks of the living great powers at the end of the 19th. Clever Frenchmen such as Renan, Flaubert, and Zola had long suspected this and said so. The French people have not produced a single new political thought since Waterloo, while all other great powers and even smaller nations entered the last quarter of the 19th century with new ideas and methods. Just think of the new style, the new sense of colonial policy, which put world traffic and thus naval warfare on a new footing, strategically exploited the coastal division of entire continents. The French people have, in fact, been fueled by a single purely negative feeling revenge. Yeah, so just to comment on what Spengler's saying here. So ultimately, he feels that France is only a great power and is a threat to Germany because of support by Britain, and that she's really a country that's in decline, like Spain was in the 18th century after the Spanish War of Succession. And just to clarify, so you mentioned Renan, Flaubert, and Zola. Renan was a famed French Orientalist who I've discussed on this channel before. But the other two, Flaubert and Zola, were both in 19th century novelists. And it's also really interesting, this idea that they've not come up with a new single political force since Waterloo. It's like they're very much stuck in the moment of Napoleon, as it were. And but I also find interesting this comment, this idea of the fueled by a single purely negative feeling, revenge. Well, there's this idea that France post-Franco-Prussian War, 1871 to 1918, the end of World War One, this idea that they wanted revanche, or the French word for revenge, against Germany, and this is the only thing that really could animate the French as a people. And if you, one way of actually understanding French politics actually is because French politics after World War One and prior to World War Two was highly volatile and unstable, and one of the reasons for that is believed is the fact that because they know Alsace-Lorraine, the lost territory, had been recovered, the cause of revanche had evaporated, and there was nothing to hold the various political factions together. But there I'll continue. But this is a thought that is quite retrospective, senile, and unfruitful, which shows that this nation has begun to live spiritually in its own memory, not for any future, but for what once existed. Even the time of Napoleon III was nothing but a bad repetition of greater days. Now, quite suddenly, the event of the end of 1918 occurred and gave this nation an impetus that came as a surprise and was bound to have a surprising effect on the aging French soul. Within a year, France had forgotten who had really been the victor. The opinion had become firmly established that France alone had won the war, and that this victory gave it the right to claim the successes of the war for itself alone, and without regard to its allies. From then on, we saw that French policy aimed, with the greatest success and with increasing certainty, and making the country that had just been saved the unconditional centre of world interests. These aims, too, which have since become increasingly clear, are without exception old and in part foreign. French thought never considered great political ideas, neither under Louis XIV, for it did not care, nor under the Italian Napoleon, but only his vanity was satisfied. The so-called ideas of the revolution are without exception of English origin. One can put oneself in the position that England in the autumn of 1918 would have claimed the feeling of sole success for itself. Then without doubt, the English aims would have been completely new, directed towards a great organisation of the Earth's surface. They would also have won over the opponent mentally. The French can't and don't want to do that. Ever since Napoleon created the French soul, or rather redeemed it from the shackles of the noble forms and conventions of feudal France, by leading his armies over the greater part of Europe and transferring the whole ambition of the race to the military side, these aims have existed and have always remained the same in their direction. There is only one kind of glory for the true Frenchman of yesterday and today, the military glory, or rather the vanity of a swashbuckler, a Cyrano, behind whom there is a Tartarin, and there is only one form in which this glory can be satiated, that is sadism practiced on the vanquished. If we contrast this with the example of England, for example, how she took advantage of the war in South Africa after having waged it cruelly and only won it after a long period of vacillation, by making a grandiose attempt to reconcile the Boers and turn them into Englishmen with their hearts. Whether this was successful is another question. One can only say that France would have despised this attempt. If one cannot treat the vanquished as the vanquished, brutally, cynically, constantly, scornfully reminding him of his defeat, devastating his country, ruining it without advantage to himself, dishonouring and insulting him with impunity, the victory as such is worth nothing. This is the basic French feeling that ultimately brought about the collapse of Napoleon's world power, because he could no longer satisfy it. For it must also be realised that at first, the English ideas of revolution, with which the French armies invaded foreign lands, had something enchanting for the peoples of these countries, and it was only when 15 years had passed and the victor had still learned nothing other than to savour the feeling of victory from Spain to Russia, that the anger of the mistreated reared its head and caused the system to collapse. The Jacobins had unleashed the common basic instincts of the French people, which the feudal powers of the Ancien Regime still held in check by Mirabeau, and some of his companions sought to ennoble or at least render harmless, first against their own good society, nobles and priests, castles and churches, then against foreign nations. The Corsican Napoleon, who had ideas, was never able to organize Europe with this nation. As German Democrats ascribed to him, his army, which emerged from the Jacobin armies, represents the true French type. It wanted to fight, burn, plunder, ravish, torture, nothing else. It was brave and courageous, but only on this condition. Napoleon knew that he only had it in his hands as long as he could sacrifice whole countries to his soldiers. Therefore, he was doomed with the retreat from Moscow. The feeling has not changed since then. Where the French have acted as colonizers in foreign parts of the world, they have shed more blood than any other nation and achieved less in colonization than any other. Wherever they have enjoyed success on the mainland for any length of time, they have left traces, none of which have been of a constructive nature. What is more, not only the way in which victory is savoured, but also the aims of the victor are 100 years old from the first to the last. In the 18th century, there was still a weak aristocratic tendency within French politics, which was neither popular at court nor among the people, and which endeavoured to challenge England for naval supremacy. As long as Admiral Suffren and Foreign Minister Vergennes were alive, as long as France possessed the Mississippi Territory, was head of England in India, both were lost in 1763. France's decline began with the Peace of Fontainebleau. There was the possibility that not only an English but also a French world power would emerge on the ruins of the Spanish world power. After the loss of the North American colonies in 1789, England was still far from having a firm grip on its non-European, sea-dominating position. It is one of the features of the French Revolution that has hitherto received far too little attention, that it fought purely inland. Girondists and Jacobins alike had not the slightest understanding of questions of naval power. The surrender of the Toulon fleet to England by the rebellious royalists was at the very beginning. All the mighty ambition of the French armies was not transferred to any French fleet. The French Revolution was thoroughly continental, and its military plans were directed exclusively at France's neighbouring countries, not overseas territories. The Frenchmen lacked the thrill of distance. Even Napoleon could not arouse enthusiasm for the fleet, just as the French are the only great people in Western Europe who never thought of seafaring, discoveries, and maritime trade on a grand scale. Its colonies always had either military significance or none at all. This course has remained unchanged ever since, and has led to England being justified in considering France the less dangerous neighbour on the continent, because it saw that the latter would never seriously oppose it at sea. With the limitation to continental interests, the question of how military expansion should be carried out is relatively simple. Firstly, around 1800, just as today and as under Louis XIV, the idea was to place the glacis of a fortress belt in front of France's eastern border, in which no power that could be considered in any way could hold itself, i.e., to transform Germany into a field of ruins in material, military, political, and even, if possible, economic terms. In addition, there are certain lines of power that run over long stretches of the mainland, each of which French policy has endeavoured to develop strategically and keep firmly in hand. The first of these lines was aimed at the German northeast coast. When Napoleon founded the Grand Duchy of Berg after the Battle of Jena, he expressly advised his brother-in-law, Murat, to bear in mind that the administration of this land was not only one stage on a larger journey. The Grand Duchy was located exactly where the Rhenish Westphalian industrial area is today. In the following year, Napoleon created the Kingdom of Westphalia from further ruins of German states, which he handed over to his brother Jerome with the order to treat it as an integral part of the French Empire. The kingdom's financial administration was actually located in Paris, in the department of the Ministry of Finance, and the Westphalian troops were part of the French Army Corps from the very beginning. Beyond the Kingdom of Westphalia, the German North Sea coast, Hamburg, Bremen, even Lubeck, were incorporated into France in 1810. The idea of a Northeast Sea Canal was considered, and thus the goal of dominating the North Sea from the coast and its hinterland was achieved. During the period of passive resistance last summer, there were repeated calls in the journals of French naval circles to take control of the North Sea coast by occupying Bremen and Hamburg. It must be realised what such an occupation would mean with the military means of power available today. First of all, in its present state of complete disarmament, Germany is naturally quite incapable of mustering even the slightest resistance to the realisation of such a plan, should it ever be seriously conceived. For the shot columns of a modern army, the distance from the Ruhr to the North Sea can be covered in 1 or 2 days. But if the coasts, which cannot be attacked at all from the sea, are in the possession of an enemy who sets up his submarines and air squadrons there without the ruin of the hinterland playing a role for him, then the blockade of the southern North Sea is achieved with the most modern means, against which there is no longer any counteraction at all from England. The second of these lines of power was also first tackled by Napoleon, albeit unsuccessfully. After Louis XIV had failed to realise the implications of suggestions in this respect, it was directed towards the North African coast and led via Egypt to Syria, i.e., in a favourable case to the domination of Turkey. In Napoleon's time, however, the expedition to the Nile was only possible by taking the risk of bypassing the English fleet, and in fact the attempt to advance further from Egypt failed the moment the French fleet was destroyed at Aboukir. Today, the situation is different. France has an enormous closed block in northwest Africa, which can be reached by the shortest on-sea route via Corsica. Here too, military interests far outweigh economic interests. France, by conferring French citizenship on coloured people, has also introduced universal conscription in large areas, and today is about to exploit a population of 50 to 60 million Negroes militarily through this conscription in exactly the same way as it is doing with the 39 million white Frenchmen themselves. It has occasionally been said quite openly by a French general that the French nation militarily numbers 100 million heads on this side and on the other side of the Mediterranean. Since the war, an immense and still increasing mass of coloured men has been trained for military service. This has taught them as a whole to think in terms of European tactics and to realise where the limit of the effectiveness of white troops lies when they have to deal with black troops in superior numbers with the same training. In addition, nationalism among the coloured people of Africa is not only evoked by this French military policy, regardless of its consequences, but also consciously supported from two other sides, albeit with very different aims. The Negroes of the United States are carrying out extraordinary propaganda, especially via Liberia, with the slogan "Africa for the Africans," propaganda that can be felt as far away as the Nile and the mining regions of South Africa. On the other hand, Islam is just as effective in its propaganda because at the same time as it is converting large masses of Negroes far beyond the equator, it is also spreading the awareness that modern Islam, which has become actively political, gives its adherents a sense of unity in the struggle against white peoples. Added to this, the Bolshevik agitation, mainly from India via East Africa, and its preparation by the Christian mission, above all the English Puritan mission, which preaches to the Negroes the equality of all men before God. Again, Spengler sort of treading old ground here. These are points regarding the Islamification of Africa and the kind of the great military hordes of Africa, are points he brought up in the previous essay as well, which I discussed in the last stream. In any case, something has been achieved which Napoleon could not yet count on, and which he never thought of, namely that Africa as a whole has ceased to be a mere object of politics and is beginning to feel more and more like a possible subject of politics. If the network of strategic railways and automobile lines planned by the French continues to expand and penetrates from West Africa across Lake Chad into the regions of the Nile and the Congo, i.e. also in a direction that once led to war between France and England in Fashoda, 1898, then it is impossible to foresee which direction the own thrust of this immense mass of awakened coloured people will take. And if they take one side or the other in any future conflicts between white powers, possibility that was first presented to them as a fact during the World War, when the decision may depend solely on the opinion of this strategically infinitely important area, and its population, which is about to feel itself to be a nation, as one of the great examples these days of a European power forging a weapon that could slip out of its hands in the future and be picked up by others. Now, in addition to these northern and southern lines, there was a middle one that was also first seen and developed by Napoleon, the land route leading down the Danube to Constantinople and the Near East. This is the goal and the reason why today, as 100 years ago, a favourite idea of French policy is the destruction of southern Germany, whose free states are known to be military creations of Napoleon, who needed a bridgehead here against Austria, and the establishment of a series of somehow dependent states up to the mouth of the Danube. As early as 1683, the siege of Vienna was undertaken by the Turks as a result of French encouragement. In 1809, Napoleon occupied the Illyrian provinces, today's Yugoslavia, and toyed with the idea of unleashing uprisings in Bohemia and Hungary, which would lead to the creation of states dependent on France. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw, like present-day Poland, was a vassal of Paris. The main reason why Alexander I broke off the alliance with Napoleon, which had dominated major politics from 1807 to 1812, was the threat to the lower Danube. Russia occupied Bessarabia in 1812. Today, France is trying to dominate this route along the Danube by making the newly created or enlarged states dependent on it through military credits, by inducing them to maintain excessively strong armies under French training and leadership, and at the same time, by penetrating the economy of a French capital. In this way, a formidable base of operations has been created which absolutely dominates the middle and lower Danube, the Black, Adriatic, and Aegean seas. Anyone who takes a look at the map today will discover that the lines not only from Yugoslavia to Romania, but also from Romania to Poland, realise old Napoleonic ideas. When Napoleon prepared to march to Russia in 1811, the alliance with Turkey had created the same basis, a front that led from the Baltic to the Black Sea and whose purpose was to exert French pressure on Eastern Europe. The fact that France had supremacy in North Africa and at the same time along the Danube as far as the Black Sea, and is also able to control foreign fleets through the harbours of Provence and Algiers, Yugoslavia and Romania, and finally Syria, when Napoleon had once failed before Acre, means that the Mediterranean Sea is surrounded on both sides. This means that all important access routes to the Near East are under French control, and today it makes no difference which sea second power has direct access. In fact, France controls it because it owns the hinterland of Tangier and is therefore in a position to block the Strait of Gibraltar from the south at any time. This is a system which avoids on all sides the question of naval supremacy from the sea, and which keeps an eye everywhere on the great continental lines of power in order to render any naval bases and naval movements from the land worthless. In addition, the securing of these lines also includes the control of the raw material areas, which supply the material for the continental armed forces, coal, iron, and oil. And in fact, it is only the case today that France directly or indirectly controls 2/3 of the continental coal deposits, whether they are in Upper Silesia, on the Ruhr, or the Saar. They're all located in such a way that France is militarily in a position to utilize the reduction for its own purposes. This is the system of barren, unimaginative power that was re-established in less than 4 years on the Napoleonic model, and is being maintained with great political skillfulness. From here, a second problem takes on a different appearance, the question of reparations. France, with the same naturalness with which it attributed the military successes of the war to itself alone, also claimed the financial successes of peace for itself and made the question of reparations truly a French one. And since the system just described, in keeping with its French character, rests militarily on a very strong basis and financially on a very weak one, the reparations question is ultimately the factor by which it can be maintained or must be abandoned. In fact, the German payments to this day can be defined in such a way that Germany maintains a French army on German soil with German money, and that every additional billion means the creation of new French regiments, air squadrons, and submarines, so that every attempt by France's allies to increase the payments represents a strengthening of the French means of power, for it is these armament subsidies alone which are able to maintain this enormous system of lines of power beyond the borders of France. You can almost say that the same to an extent for the American military presence in Europe. Ultimately, though we're not all paying subsidies to the Americans, we still are very much in their economic sphere of influence, and so we're sort of helping pay for the army that is occupying or protecting, depending on how you interpret the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This could possibly lead to a surprising turn of events when a struggle begins again that has disappeared from our view since the war, but which it was already raging relentlessly before the war, the silent, tenacious struggle without mercy between the political leadership of the states and the international high finance that wants to subjugate them. It is the attempt which was and still is very perceptible to those who know the circumstances in the Roman world, from the Second Punic War to the days of Caesar, to allow the great political decisions to take place apparently in favour of individual peoples, but in fact in the interest of a monetary power not bound to countries and peoples, which, depending on whether it grants credit to the states or not, recognises and increases the indebtedness of states or not, undermines or raises the power of states on the stock exchange, gradually turns major politics into an object of banking considerations and stock exchange speculation, transforms the granting of credit into a kind of financial protectorate, and thus politics itself into a kind of business enterprise. Starting in America, the struggle will increasingly come to the fore again in the coming years. I do not go into these things any further, but it is very important, especially for the very near future, that politicians should realise that the United States has never pursued any real policy, as much as it is not a real state, but that its policy since 1865 has been controlled without exception by financial powers in the background, before the war, during the war, and especially now, when it is a question of putting the result of the war into a financial form. Industry does not control politics. High finance controls both. The fact is that a shift in the reparations problem from a struggle between political powers to a struggle between political and financial powers with unforeseeable consequences for the economy has suddenly become possible and even probable. Here, at least, Paris represents politics, New York represents finance, and London too, I'd add to that. In the face of this world of changed forms, it is now surprising to note that the British government has adopted an unusually uncertain attitude since the war. One of the reasons is clear. England has been governed in the period which it is deciding, perhaps has already been decided its fate, by Labour leaders, first by Lloyd George, originally of the extreme left, and now by Ramsay MacDonald. Here too, it can be seen that the political school which the domestic politician undergoes in popular assemblies is not the one which the foreign diplomat needs. A gifted mass agitator is almost never able to think in a statesmanlike manner. The present superiority of French diplomacy, which every day proves, in due to the fact that all the political leaders of France, worth mentioning during the period of the Entente Cordiale, learnt the Petersburg School at close quarters and passed through it with great success. If anywhere in the world today there are still remnants of a diplomacy of the great old Russian style, it is in Paris, and it is these diplomats who are far superior to the English leaders of the Union, to say nothing of Germany. It was suddenly thrust into foreign policy as a result of the victory of one party, at the very moment when, owing to the transformation of all political forms in the world, England was in urgent need for reorganisation of her methods. The question is whether England will ever be able to make up for the time lost in those years, because the historical transformation is progressing at the speed of a catastrophe. Looking back to the period before the war, from Waterloo to 1914, there was essentially a uniform and balanced system of power distribution within which political decisions were made. The group of states of the 18th century, which was led by a number of cabinets in the service of princely houses, was shaken by Napoleon and overcome its final form. Or rather, in its form, rather. What emerged at the Congress of Vienna was the concert of great powers, founded and maintained by Metternich. In the 19th century, a great power was understood to be a state that was recognised as equal by a certain number of others. These powers only negotiated with each other on an equal footing. They entered into friendly or hostile relations with each other. Tensions arose, wars broke out between them, but care was taken at all costs to ensure that the system as such was not shaken, i.e. that even in the event of a great victory, the victor did not rise above his equals. I take the example of the Franco-Prussian War. The other great powers, England and Russia, first and foremost would have intervened immediately and energetically if a serious attempt had been made to eliminate one of them as a great power and thus raise another one above the level playing field. This was what kept the Crimean War, the German-Austrian War, and the Russo-Turkish War within certain limits from the outset with regard to the consequences of victory. This system of equilibrium has been so strong that newly emerging states such as Germany and Italy have entered without changing the existing form. After the Spanish War, America joined. After the Chinese War, Japan joined. The two powers were recognised, and from then on, they continued to support the condition of equilibrium. So that he's talking about the the Spanish-American War of 1898, and then with the Chinese War, he's talking about the Boxer Rebellion that happened in 1899 to 1900. This balance was maintained by the ever-growing mass of standing armies, or rather it was one of the causes of this increase in armies. The jealousy that could be discharged always postponed the discharge to future opportunity. The age of standing armies, and this brings me to the most important point, brought with it as an inner necessity the attempt to create a kind of equilibrium at sea, which England had to prevent at all costs. One state after another, including Germany, was faced with the very serious question of what attitude it should adopt in matters of naval armaments. The balance seems untenable if it was represented exclusively by an army that was not matched by a fleet at sea. Not only might certain operations on land become impossible, but the economic and financial prerequisites for waging war with such armies could possibly be cancelled out. If Austria was not fully taken for granted at the turn of the century, this was partly due to the fact that the Austrian fleet was not even strong enough for a coastal defence. The questions of naval supremacy was the secret and pressing issue of the entire 19th century. This is all the more remarkable as the decision was obviously sought on land due to the enormous numbers of standing armies. But precisely because the decisions here impose such an extraordinary responsibility on the leading statesman, because its development was completely obscure and no one could overlook the consequences of a declaration of war. The tendency began from 1870 onwards to evade this fact by anticipating the decision at sea in some form or another. At first, this was done in such a way that the powerful fleets, another phenomenon peculiar to this century, tried to outstrip each other in terms of numbers. At the outbreak of the World War, we had reached the point where all the great states of the world were trying to overcome each other in the pace of armaments, not only by continuing to increase their land formations, but also by continuing to strengthen their battle squadrons, thus shifting the decision not to the battle but to the preparation for it, to technical invention and financial efficiency. I'm convinced that basically no power was as serious about the idea of a naval battle as the land army was with the operational plans of the general staffs. For the modern fleets had hardly received the equipment that they still possess today when a completely different kind of competition began on the seas. The turning point was during the North American Civil War. Within 3 years, sailing ships were replaced by steamships, wooden ships by armoured ships, light artillery by heavy and very heavy artillery. Finally, the torpedo boat was added as a new weapon in the battle between the northern and southern states. Towards the end of the war, 1865, the battle fleet was essentially as it was in 1914, armoured ships of the same type armed with the heaviest guns. But in the meantime, the race had begun that we have just mentioned, not to jeopardise this extremely dangerous and dubious weapon, which had never been properly tested, but to exploit it in such a way that a decision was certain even without a battle. A race begins in all parts of the world for the occupation and fortification of coastal routes that could form secure bases for such a fleet, for points such as Malta, Aden, Singapore, Hong Kong, Port Arthur, Hawaii, Panama, the Bermudas, for the simple reason that if a power in a sea has these points securely in its hands, a naval war is decided in advance. An enemy fleet cannot hold its own in these waters. This means that the naval war is decided before the war begins by playing the bases off against each other. This has been a very important feature of European colonial policy since 1870. Until then, it could be said that the occupation of coastal routes, especially in Africa, was based solely on the economic considerations. It was a matter of obtaining raw materials and sales territories. In addition, however, there was an increasingly determined and purposeful desire to gain control of the coastal points that could be strategically considered in the event of war. And when the idea of defining China in spheres of interest of European states was familiarized in the 1890s, economic considerations no longer played any role at all, and the choice of areas to be occupied and the gaining of strategic points was the only consideration. In those years, names such as Port Arthur, Waiheiwei, and Jiaozhou were the most important than the coal fields and the major trading cities. The whole thing is based on the strategic fact that no longer exists, namely that for those who have the coast, the hinterland is also a secure possession, because there was not a single power in Africa and Asia that could have or hold the coast in its power from the hinterland. As I said, Africa was merely an object of politics, including the Boer states in Egypt. The occupation of coast, therefore, meant the possession of a corresponding area of influence in the interior, and thus the question of economic significance was settled by itself. In the meantime, a change has taken place here. To the same extent that the interior of Africa is beginning to show its own political aims and inclinations, as in South Africa, where the overthrow of General Smuts by Herzog has now only shown it again, as India was showing more and more clearly the intention of taking its fate into its own hands, and as from Russia the whole interior of China is being stirred up by Bolshevik agitation. To the same extent has the domination of the coast become possible from both sides, the sea or the hinterland. But then the mainland has the advantage under all circumstances. The time of England's naval supremacy is drawing to a close. Now suddenly, for a very short number of years, we are faced with the possibility that the largest landmass on Earth, the Europe-Asia-Africa bloc, will take the fate of the world into its own hands militarily, through inland lines of power, so that the neighbouring seas as England's old dominions will no longer be the bearers of the decision, but possibly the mere objects of it. It's very interesting. Like Spengler seems to be pre-anticipating Eurasianism, especially the idea that the third world, as we call it, or anyone that's not the first world, so sort of Russia, China, and those other countries are all organising in some like anti-Western bloc and are trying to assert some dominance to create a multipolar world. English naval supremacy during the 19th century was based on the fact that whoever owned the sea also owned the land. The borders of England were in fact the coasts of all the great seas. It is possible that by the middle of this century, the relationship has already been reversed, that the age of standing fleets and competition for coastal points has been replaced by another in which it is a matter of keeping the coast under control from inland with the help of aircraft squadrons and submarine stations, thus abolishing the sense of a battle fleet. The concept of naval supremacy would thus be transferred from the fleet to the mainland. The fate of Russia, which today once again belongs to Asia, both mentally and politically, cannot be separated from the fate of inner Asia, and here too it can be seen that all the forms of world politics have fundamentally changed. Russian policy, as we took it for granted before the war, was based on an idea that originated exclusively in the mind of Peter the Great, and which contradicted everything that had been the spiritual tradition of the Russian people. Up to that time and beyond, Peter the Great turned the direction of Russian policy from Siberia, the Caspian Sea, and the Black Sea exclusively towards Western Europe and the Baltic Sea. From then on, for 2 centuries, the entire system of Russian foreign policy was anchored in the large legation posts of the Western states. What the ambassadors in Berlin, Vienna, Paris, and London carried out was Russian policy. It was the use of the resources of Asia for goals that lay in Western Europe, and the system led to its greatest triumph precisely at the end of the Napoleonic rule, when Alexander I moved into Paris as protector of Europe and established the Holy Alliance, that is, placed the European world of states under Russian protection in terms of its tradition. Bolshevism in its oldest form, which today can be labelled with the name Lenin, and which I am not convinced ended with Lenin's which I am convinced ended with Lenin's death, has not changed this. The original Bolshevism is European, and that is Western European, in its whole world of thoughts and also in the origin of a large part of its bearers. It has not changed the fact that Asia continues to be used as a means to the European ends. The great ambassadorships with which St. Petersburg worked have been replaced by a group of communist parties with which the government in Moscow works, and the idea of a Holy Alliance continues in the idea of an alliance of the proletariat of the Western countries again under the Soviet star. It is still a question of subordinating Western Europe to Russian interests in some form or another and making Russian ideas usable for its own peoples. I believe that this direction has been completed with the death of Lenin. I am convinced that the Russian Asian Empire, as it formed in 1917 and as it lasted for 6 years, can no longer be maintained, and that we must not, as one must temporarily assume, reckon with a slow development from within that will turn the present state into a viable order, but that new upheavals, religious, military, political, economic, which in Russia can never be separated from one another, will spread across the Russian Asian earth, shocks that are just as deep and perhaps bloodier than the first. For a power is now quietly emerging that has been silent until now and has therefore not been seen. The Russian peasantry, which was then before Peter the Great, which slept and waited during the Petrine period, slept and waited during Lenin's time, and today appears in a very deep religious ferment, an incalculable mass of people about to awaken. It is not only the peasantry that sits on the black earth, but the entire nation that has lived for many centuries from the Vistula to India and China, whether it is called Russian, Tartar, or Mongolian, and over which all historical events and cultures since Genghis Khan have slipped like shadows. Up till now, the Russian armies have been able to do what they wanted with it, but from time to time, a religious fervour has been observed, which has found expression in the appearance of holy peasants and prophets, and has been suppressed by the government as far as possible. One cannot shake off the feeling that this deepest anti-Bolshevik sentiment has been strengthened by the fact that Soviet ideas have lost the political and economic magic that originally clung to them, and even more so by the fact that the terrible suffering of these 6 years is no longer perceived as a sacrifice for a cause, but as a useless sacrifice, and further begins to be strengthened by the fact that an explosion of metaphysical fervour caused by a leader who emerges somehow and somewhere can suddenly turn into a political wave that in a few years will change the face of Asia irresistibly and forever. It must be realised that the time has passed when, as a result of the balance of the great powers, only European-style armies were able to bring about real change in Asia. Today, every kind of political power and tradition throughout the world is so disintegrated that relatively few small forces are capable of bringing about quite extraordinary upheavals. Such a possibility was once very close to the appearance of Baron von Ungern-Sternberg in Turkestan, who in 1920 brought together an army directed against Bolshevism, with which he would have had Central Asia firmly in his hands after a short time. This man unconditionally tied the population of large areas to himself, and he had wanted to do, if he had wanted to, and the Bolsheviks had not succeeded in eliminating him, it's impossible to foresee what the picture of Asia would be like today. In these areas, such an army of enthusiastic followers of a born leader, adventurer and conqueror, as Enver Pasha was, were to set out with the slogan Asia for the Asians. It is certain that it would find no serious obstacles either in China or in India. This sounds fabulous to us because we ourselves have never experienced anything like it, but it has happened more than once in history, and the collapse of Tsarism in this horrific form would have seemed like a madman's dream to the whole world as a prophecy 3 years earlier. We have to bear in mind that the whole obstacle to such upheavals, the system of standing armies, has been shaken and is in the process of disappearing. The revolutionary mood of all countries has transformed the spirit of these armies. The question is whether general mobilization is still possible anywhere without serious unrest. The dark possibility is looming on the horizon that a diplomatic style, which has now brought the small entente into being, for example, which holds the great one together, will suddenly become completely impossible because somewhere in Asia or Africa, changes in political form will occur, which one has not yet even dared to consider theoretically. And then when he's talking about the small entente, he's talking about the little entente of France's series of allies in Eastern Europe to help contain Germany, namely Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia, and Poland as well to an extent. For this, in is a new element in great politics. The completely changed influence which in all states of white peoples, domestic politics has gained on the army and thus on foreign policy. Since the great cities have become the real bearers of modern politics, we have seen the fact emerge that the great Labour parties are revolutionary in their nature and also wanted and had to be revolutionary in their methods. This had almost been lost in the last decades before the war. No matter how much the parties in the individual countries described themselves and behaved as revolutionary, violence hardly played a role in their tactical thinking. Max Bernstein had already expressed this against Babel. Babel, by the way, was one of the leaders of the German Social Democratic Party. He died in 1913, just before the outbreak of World War I. It was realised or believed to be so that the standing armies represented such an irresistible force that the mere thought of a violent counteraction was pointless. A company of machine guns was enough to keep thousands of strikers at bay, because the real combat value of this company cannot be judged. During the World War, the revolutionary elements in the large cities were again able to gain wealth of experience of what the outcome of an armed conflict would be. The war, with its numerous bombardments and conquests of large cities, was a test of the limits of the effectiveness of regular troops in street fighting. It has shown everyone that our large stone cities, even when skillfully defended by weaker forces, are objects that are difficult and almost impossible to conquer by an army fighting with all the modern means of power. And that suddenly, and without exception, in all countries, the conviction has reappeared in the minds of people who call themselves revolutionaries that a revolution can be carried out by revolutionary means. In any case, the fact is that the opinion that there are only parliamentary ways, elections, votes, refusal of the budget, in extreme cases against a general strike, is outdated, and thus all traditional forms of internal politics have become unsafe. All these forms were based on the barely conscious agreement that the opponents would submit to the form, even if it had led to defeat in individual cases. As soon as he who no longer sees any advantage for himself in the form no longer respects it as such, constitutional internal politics can no longer be carried out at all, and force takes the place of negotiation. This formal equilibrium between the parties was absolutely present before the war in all the well-governed states of Europe, even in Russia, and today it is no longer assured in any country in the world. This is the fact which great politics must reckon with. One may estimate it as one pleases, but even in the land of classical parliamentarism, in England, the relation is such today that the radical working masses have no respect for its parliamentary forms, nor would they seriously shrink from using extra parliamentary means if the others no longer led to the goal. This is the most favourable case. In other countries, the situation is far less favourable. The consequence of this, since everything has its counter effect, is that even within the social classes, which have hitherto preserved the existing internal forms out of tradition, a sense of justice or reverence, respect for these forms is more and more dwindling. For here, the realization is penetrating that a form which is not respected by the other party has ceased to be something which one can govern at all. We see today that the mismanagement of the great countries even transfers the seat of decision-making out of Parliament into the neighbourhood of private but influential personalities, into financial or military circles, while apparently preserving parliamentary forms, or that it does not preserve the parliamentary form and now tries to achieve by some exceptional circumstances what the Constitution itself no longer guarantees. We are now on this road, and the great politics is assuming more and more the character of a rule led by individual personalities without accountability and subjectively, who try to secure the realization of their plans internally by all means within their reach, as we can see in Italy and in Spain in one way and in Russia in another. We are now entering an age in which foreign policy too, in the form that has grown up super-personally and for centuries, which we can somehow characterize with the words legitimacy, constitution, political tradition, diplomatic style, is changing into forms that spring from the character of individual personalities. Of Russia, it may be said that the Soviet Republic was Lenin's personal form. In South Africa, long before the war, the organization of the group of states was a very personal expression of Cecil Rhodes's way of working. And today's Italy corresponds to Mussolini's personal taste. It is the Caesarism of the future that manifests itself in these phenomena. It is proof of Metternich's deep insight into the future when he wrote in 1820, "I came into the world either too early or too late. Now I feel good for nothing. In the past I would have enjoyed the time. Later I would have served to rebuild. Today I spend my life shoring up the rotten buildings. I should have been born in 1900 and had the 20th century ahead of me. And my most secret thought is that the old Europe is at the beginning of its end, determined to go down with it. I'll know how to do my duty. The new Europe, on the other hand, is still in the making. Between the end and the beginning, there will be chaos." I think that's an absolutely fascinating observation by Metternich, very much seeing himself as coming between two ages, and that he was ultimately presiding over the doom of an old system he was trying to prop up, and lamenting that ultimately he could not be the master of the old system or the innovating master of a new one. But this fading of tradition has not yet matured into a catastrophe in the time of Bismarck and Gladstone. At that time, even to the strongest personality had to devote the vast majority of his labour and energy to working within the shackles and against the resistance of a form that was unshakable as such in order to achieve the desired goal despite all obstacles. This resistance no longer exists today. If Bismarck were to govern today, he'd probably have to devote his labour entirely to his goal and not primarily to overcoming resisting traditions. Future politics, whether we think of England or Russia or Japan or other countries, will be conducted either by the presence or absence of individuals of rank, who will work according to their private will, in which case, in spite of all the means of power and all the constitutional forms of government, the fate of the country will be extremely serious. This means that in the future there is a growing possibility for Germany to be led beyond everything that now seems hopeless through the emergence of decisive personalities. In an age where it is individuals and not impersonal forms that represent destiny, even a defeated and half-destroyed country can rise to enormous importance overnight. But we can only speak of this in the words of Hamlet. The readiness is all. And that was the end of that chapter. So some very interesting observations and predictions of Spengler for world international politics. So my voice is starting to go a bit. So we'll read this next one because I know this is a bit of a shorter one. So yeah, this is only 6 pages. So it's called The Tasks of Nobility. Speech given on the 16th of May 1924 at the German Day of Nobility in Breslau. If I take the liberty of saying something about the tasks of the German nobility today, I must limit myself to their political side given the short time available. The revolution destroyed almost everything that was a prerequisite for successful politics. Above all, this includes the social and political structure of the nobility as an organic stratum within the nation. Every large country has domestic and foreign policy tasks to fulfill, which require the existence of a unified class that thinks, feels, and acts in a unified manner, without which a consistent solution to these tasks cannot be guaranteed. Where this layer is lacking, higher politics very soon becomes entirely dependent on the presence of very talented individual personalities. In Germany, this superstructure has been shaken to the core by the revolution. It is probably the most dangerous result of the upheaval. If the revolution dissolved the army, it can be rebuilt. A lost position of power can be reconquered, but the body of the people wounded from within is very difficult to heal, even if the shattering of society has not led to the dissolution of its leading stratum. World history teaches us that this supporting, breeding, and educating class generally contained a naive aristocracy at its core. A well-known example is Rome, where the racial characteristics of the people were developed to the point of pure culture and a number of large families. Every genuine nobility within a people is race in its purest form, not only delimited by descent, but the epitome of certain instincts of command, organisation, negotiation, and sense of responsibility. In short, a superiority in all areas of practical national life. The nobility is a political class through and through. Politics understood as a war, with the means of intellectual and social tactics. Diplomacy externally and internally was never anything other than the duel with bloodless weapons. The entire fate of the people often enough lay in the abilities of the nobility. However, political defeats also hit the nobility first and throw them off course. This is the case in Germany today, and to a particularly high degree. But it is precisely Germany which, as a result of its miserable development since the 30 Years' War, has not preserved a distinguished civil society in the manner of the English and French, that cannot do without the nobility as the centre of its leading classes. Not only for its own sake does the nobility therefore have a duty to regain its former importance, not by attempting to regain old privileges, which would be futile, but by educating itself to inner superiority, an education that Frederick William I, who is possible for himself and his civil servants and officers. In our political and geographical situation, we cannot remain dependent on the chance appearance of Bismarck or Napoleon. England teaches us a great lesson in this. Over the last 200 years, it has rarely had a brilliant leader of the calibre of Pitt, but all middle-ranking leaders were able to surround themselves with a layer of collaborators who instinctively understood and mastered the necessary goals and means, and they could rely on the instincts of the English upper class, which was permeated and educated by the families of the native nobility, especially the gentry. Only in this way was it possible for England to progress on its course, even though it had not had a great prime minister for decades. very interesting observation by Spengler, the idea that we haven't had a great prime minister since William Pitt, but this idea that ultimately our governments are like a cabinets of great talents drawn from the nobility and middle classes. So it's very much showing the oligarchic nature that I think has really pretty much ruled Britain since the Glorious Revolution. This instinct of a class cannot be replaced by patriotic programs and views. Opinions are based on reasons, but the course of world history is not governed by a program, and the better reasons never guarantee the better success. The political instinct, however, is not learnt at universities and from books and newspapers, but is awakened, for instance, in earlier centuries by the education of pages, and in England today by social discipline and personal contact between young men and politically experienced men in these distinguished clubs. For practical success, it is not important to analyse the great facts and situations intellectually, but to feel at first glance what possibilities lie within them and what means are applicable. Every duel with the naked weapon, every hunt fit for the field, every game has its emotional logic, and this logic, not the logic of philosophy, is also the logic of political success. England in particular shows the dangers of misjudging these facts. In recent years, England has had two heads of state who emerged from domestic politics, not to say the trade union movement, and who, through the pressure of events, succeeded in taking control of foreign policy. Lloyd George and Ramsay MacDonald. Interestingly, they're the two prime ministers that he mentioned in the last essay as well. Both have fatally worsened the condition of England. That this has not led to an outright defeat, England owes to the instincts of her society, which, even against the will of the ruling personalities, has kept the general course of politics on the level. When there is a class of the same tendency, abuses of this kind are mitigated by the persistence of what is called the will of a country, which operates impersonally and without communication in the great many individuals. If we look at the world situation today, which since the World War has been driving towards final decisions with increasing speed, we recognise that of all the peoples, the one whose leading class has the superior capabilities will ultimately win the race. Whether the army has been destroyed, whether the economy has been shattered, whether foreign possessions have been lost or fallen away, all this is of secondary importance to the question of whether the leader, the backbone of the nation, has remained capable. If the Romans were ultimately able to cope with all their opponents and the Imperium Romanum was a Roman one, they owed it neither to the intelligence in the forum nor to the mere training of the legions, but to the class of old families who, even after Cannae and after the civil wars of Marius and Sulla, upheld the political tradition and were superior to the Carthaginians and Greeks in terms of foresight. We Germans find ourselves in a present that no country has had to endure for a century. We live cut off as if on an island. We are not even masters in our own country. We have to maintain a French army on German soil with German money. And yet, through a superior policy, we could conquer a position that would turn our geographical position from a disadvantage to an advantage. Between the coming of Russia and the English naval power in the centre, which is in an internal crisis, but for this we must educate people who, in addition to the old Prussian qualities of discipline, responsibility and renunciation, also possess the real political virtues, which have so far been a result of a rare coincidence and not a social breeding. This is the real task of the German nobility. It is precisely for this reason, however, that certain traits that were still inherent in almost all strata of our people at the outbreak of the World War must be observed with particular concern. Since we no longer have any colonies and hardly any Germans abroad, our thinking on political issues has become far too domestic and provincial. Although the soul of the homeland is the basis of a healthy folkdom, and especially of a healthy nobility, it must not be the horizon of political considerations. With its 60 million inhabitants, Germany is a very small country on the surface of the earth, and therefore also a political entity that can and must only be viewed in the context of world politics. Precisely because of the current weakness, it is even more important than before the war that every politically active person has a constant overview of the situation and events on the Pacific, in South Africa, in North America, that he keeps himself constantly informed of the moods and opinions over there through newspapers and personal contact. We can only turn our fate around if we constantly have world political considerations in mind, otherwise the calculation will be wrong. But this is precisely what is lacking everywhere. We have become a big people too quickly. Barely 50 years ago, at the time of our grandfathers, there was still a handful of German states, Länder, and small states, each of which has only local politics and hardly knew world politics in the English sense of the word. We are far from having overcome this narrowness. Infinitely much of what lies behind the words folkish and national is based on a completely unfamiliarity with the political thinking and will outside Germany, and a fatal underestimation of the enemy's superiority in political means, points of view and methods. Overnight, we have become a people with world industry, world trade, and naval power, so that there are still countless Germans who feel that the goals of the economic circles and interests are unnational because their horizons extend beyond their national circles and interests. But since Bismarck, a German policy is only possible if it is anchored in the entire breadth of today's world context, and if the supporting class considers it foremost duty to educate itself for this policy of broad horizons and superior means. This is where I currently see the great mission of the German aristocracy, and above all the youth within it. It does not have it easy in this respect. Every young Englishman of standing has been in the colonies, and through personal contact with the circles which govern or are economically active there, has acquired a feeling for the real meaning of political affairs. Our youth did not get out enough before the war. Instead of India, Egypt, and America, it was lecture theatre, court assessor. The first closer contact with bigger politics over there was by going to the countries with which England had to do, for example, as private secretary to a governor or envoy. In our country, it must be openly admitted, it is usually through patriotic books, festivals, and lectures from which the hard and thankless detailed work that prepares for success could certainly not be deduced, even less studied. Today, for political and economic reasons, foreign countries are almost close to our youth. It is therefore all the more important to take every opportunity to get to know it in its present mood by studying its newspapers, assemblies, economic institutions, statistics, laws, establishing personal relationships with significant personalities in the decisive circles. Such political study trips should be undertaken, prepared, and utilised as often as possible as work, not as recreation, as the Japanese have understood it in our country. At home, however, a conscious education is necessary in order to familiarise oneself with the current spirit of the foreign superpowers, which makes things appear considerably different in one's own country. Kind of really interesting because this again calls back to the essay I read last week where Spengler was addressing the German youth, this idea that in order to save Germany from her present situation, the youth have to work and study hard abroad and understand world politics. And it's actually interesting because one of Spengler's main critiques of the mid-century Germans came from the fact that he saw them as too folkish and too nativist and not really understanding international politics. It is a good German quality to be able to put oneself in the mind of foreign times and people. It is precisely this quality that should be utilised. It is fundamentally wrong to express the justified feeling of the vanquished towards the victor by refusing to immerse oneself in his world, to engage seriously with him at all. It should become a daily habit, especially for the young nobility, to read the leading newspapers of the foreign powers, constantly comparing them carefully, working through the most important brochures with a pencil in hand, keeping abreast of political and public opinion from leading journals and through letters. Only in this way can German isolation be overcome spiritually. There is no way into the future by returning to the so-called ideals, which easily play a disastrous role at our national festivals, and which in the middle of the 20th century have become limited, provincial, hopeless ideals. The English Conservative has always been characterised as a politician by being even more modern in his means and ends than the majority of liberals. I therefore conclude with the following admonition. Let go of the mental barriers that separate you from the guiding principle of world politics. World politics destroys those countries that are not spiritually equal to it. Learn from the English nobility, who had a very difficult position in a country without peasants, that there are basically no obstacles and no limits to successful internal superiority. Strip away the last remnants of the country's special position and its aversion to world horizons, world trade, and world industry. In Germany, we have had brilliant results wherever talent has been systematically bred in the army, in technology, in industry, in world trade. We could achieve the same in politics, but then we must realise that politics today is something different from the conservative politics of 1860 and even the 1900s. And the nobility above all must become aware of the task of growing spiritually beyond the people in its political horizon in order to regain a decisive position for Germany in world politics with the upspent forces of this people. Yeah, another absolute banger from Spengler. So we've gone for about an hour, so I think I'll end it there for this week. I think next time I do an episode of this, we'll carry on because these essays are amazing, and we can see next time we've got Nietzsche and his century. So, just in terms of Schilling, next Tuesday there will not be an episode of Archival Discourses. There's going to be a very special stream with Semiagog. He and I are going to be discussing the book The Anglo-American Establishment by Carol Quigley. So if you're interested in the elite of the late British Empire and the kind of global financial structure that we all live under, so to speak, and its consequences. Stay tuned for that stream. The week after, I will continue archival discourses on Tuesday, provided nothing else comes up. Let me just check if I've had any super chats. Okay, no super chats. Well, thank you everybody for watching, and have a good night.